So welcome everyone today to Reflect, Restart and Rethink. My name's Andrew Jack. I'm the Global Education Editor at the Financial Times, and it's a great pleasure to have some wonderful panelists before us and a great and growing audience of other attendees from business schools and related institutions around the world. This is a bit of an experiment. We initially were planning to participate in an EFMD conference in person back in the spring, hosted by St. Gallen, and of course COVID got in the way. And since then, of course, there's been ever more disruption in the world of business education, as well as, of course, the wider economic and social world that we're living through. And so we thought it would be useful to have a series of sessions by and for business school experts to share thoughts and best practices as we move into this new era, and particularly now as people are beginning to gear up for the idea of a fresh academic year in the era of COVID. So we've got four great panelists with us to begin our discussions today. And then in the second half, very keen to turn over to you to hear your reflections, suggestions, and questions for each other and for the panel. We're using the Q&A function on this call, so I'd invite you from now on, please, to use that to post questions and to upvote any questions and reflections that you'd like us all to discuss today. The panel also will be viewable, incidentally, post our live event today. And as you know, and I'll say at the end of this again, we will have three sessions in total over the next 3 weeks. So there are two more to come that we'd very much invite you to register for as well. So thanks all for coming along. And let's begin then. I'll just briefly introduce our panelists. So we have Julia Balandina-Jacquier, who's on the MBA elective faculty at the University of St. Gallen and a guest speaker at IMD. Amy Hillman, Dean at the W.P. Carey School of Business in Arizona State University. David Lefebvre, Director of the EdTech Lab at Imperial College Business School in London. And Mohan Sawhney, who's Clinical Professor of Marketing and Director of the Center of Research in Technology and Innovation at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. So let's begin talking a little bit about how we got to where we are, how challenging, how disruptive it's been for each of you to have to adjust, perhaps initially in the short term, to sometimes almost overnight teaching, moving from the classroom to online as the core way to deliver teaching, as well as, of course, management and indeed continuing research activities for faculty. Maybe we'll start with you, Amy. Arizona, which of course has long been a leader in online education. How much of a shock and how much of a change over the last 3 or 4 months have you been living through?
It was a big shock, I think, like everyone. We made it work, but we do have a large number of our faculty, roughly a third, who have taught completely asynchronous online courses before. And of course, because we have a set of online degrees, we have instructional designers and all the technology that is associated with a completely asynchronous learning environment, a hybrid learning environment between the synchronous and the asynchronous, and of course our campus immersion program. So I think we probably got lucky that we had been in the business of online degrees, because we had the infrastructure to very quickly prop up teaching workshops on Zoom and all of the trainings that the faculty who have never taught any way other than on campus could jump right into.
So given, as you say, you had that infrastructure in place and and your institution has long been involved in online, what perhaps particular pain points or shocks nonetheless for this whole-scale transition for you?
Yeah, so we, for example, we were able to keep our faculty could go in and teach in our classrooms, and they have incredible technology. They already have the cameras that track them and the microphones in the ceiling and the two-way cameras. So we were very lucky. Now, not all of our classrooms had that technology, but we were able to quickly put those who wanted to still go onto campus and teach to an empty classroom. They were able to, and of course faculty like to stand and they like to write on the whiteboards and they like to, use the document cams. And so that made a lot of our faculty really, really happy. And they also could go in and teach from their offices if they had child issues at home or bandwidth issues. So that was good, but it was still quite a shock for our faculty who were finding themselves at home teaching with unreliable technology. And of course, Zoom wasn't as great then as it is today.
So Mohan Sawhney, tell us a little bit about your experience. How much of a transition did you have to go through, and how familiar already were you with online approaches and tools?
So I think the biggest challenge for us was the very uncertain and dynamic situation of the lockdown. Arizona had a much more lenient policy of lockdown, which is challenging them now. But Illinois went into strict lockdown. We were not able to access our offices within 2 weeks. In fact, 2 weeks before the quarter was starting, we were training and getting ready to teach from our classrooms. But then the lockdown order came, and I have not been to my office in the past 5 months. I have not visited. We are not allowed to go in. Our building is in lockdown. So we were then forced to move to home-based instruction. And as Amy is pointing out, the technology at home, whether it's the bandwidth or the hardware, for that matter, Zoom was very unreliable also. I mean, it has come a long way since then. So it was pretty challenging because there was a lot of, faculty were on all sorts of ends of this continuum of sophistication to, I don't know what the heck is going on, but we all had to. But we adapted. And I think the good news is that some of us, me particularly, for the past 2 years, I've been doing a lot of durable online programs. These are SPOCs. These are not MOOCs, but these are small private online courses. So I have one on AI, one on product strategy, one on digital marketing. So these programs, because they've been running for 2 years and I've been doing a lot of webinars, so I and a few of my other faculty colleagues were equipped to do this, but we have not done live streaming for 100% of the content. So it involved redesigning our content to be sort of modular and chunked, reimagining our exercises, building the technology at home, creating quiet spaces and the environment at home. And I think one of the things that we did, which was very effective, was our executive education shut down, right? The in-person executive education. We took those program managers and made them into virtual content moderators. So they would assist faculty in running the Zoom sessions, in hand raising and so on, and managing all of the logistics so that the faculty could concentrate on teaching. That was a very effective experiment, and we'll continue to do that as we head into the fall when we can actually go back into the classrooms.
So Julia, you teach in a couple of different institutions, but you're a sort of external person as well. Did that present any particular challenges, perhaps suddenly having to adapt to different platforms and approaches and the online rather than the physical presence in the classroom?
Yes, I mean, it was, of course, a surprise. I was lucky that I was not the first of the elective. I understood that one professor had 2 days to turn from in class to online format and was sweating but did quite well. I think, I had a bit of a notice, so had a time to prepare. I was also probably fortunate because I teach also small executive education program online, but in live webinars. I think for me, the challenge was having a larger group versus, a more intimate one whom you already met and know personally, how to build rapport. I think technology worked well. You obviously need to try to use as much as possible out of Zoom, squeeze as much as possible. Of course, as Mahambir said, you need to chunk and restructure the things, but actually looking in the eyes of the students and try to understand whether they get you, whether they're with you or you've lost them. that was a bit more difficult, particularly that with the larger groups, you cannot even see all of them on the screen, right? You see only part of them. And that I found very, very challenging.
And at the end of the day, or at least so far in the transition, how does it feel for you now? Are you more comfortable? Do you think there are some perhaps even unexpected benefits that this has brought?
I think it's been a great learning because it makes you, it forced probably all of us to be more creative, because I had to restructure my whole course, because I think, already you try to be interactive, but in being interactive online, and particularly the elective going for the whole week, 6 hours per day, you need to really make sure that you keep the attention. So you need to chunk, and not only chunk, you need to provide them more breaks, i.e. you need to choose what is the most important, the core materials. You need to change all the time the, the type of exercises, the format, chat groups, then you split them in separate groups. You do an exercise, then you do a quiz. So every 15 minutes, there would be something else. So they keep alert and they know they need to be listening, because something would come and they will be asked to talk. And also, I think for me, the major learning was that it is particularly important to really make them prepare for the class. So previous education, because you cannot do a lot of lecturing, so really, make sure that they read. Can be difficult, but some quizzes, some mini exams before the course might help motivate the students to prepare really for the class.
So David, let's hear about your experience. You've obviously been involved also in digital technologies and tools for some time, but how much of a shock was the transition then for you?
Well, March was a real shock. It was a real tough time. In fact, I think this conversation is triggering PTSD in my at the moment. It was really tough. I mean, at Imperial, like ASU, we've been delivering online courses since about 2003. We deliver about 200 modules a year. Most of our faculty have taught online for a number of years, and we have a suite of online degree programs. So you'd think that we were very well prepared for this. But the issue is that what we've been sort of pursuing over the past 15 years is the idea of extremely high quality, high impactful online education. And to that end, when we build a module, we typically give faculty a team of support people, and we spend 9 months to build a single module. And our output is typically 15 modules a year maximum. And what we found in March was that we had to move online within 24 hours and move 115 modules online within 24 hours. So, of course, all that sort of inherited knowledge wasn't relevant. And we quickly moved everything to webinar format like everybody else. But we didn't believe that this was going to be sufficient to give students the same kind of impactful experience that they were paying for. So at the same time as sort of mobilizing the webinar format, we were working quickly behind the scenes to enhance the courses using the lessons we had from our online learning. But again, in order to enhance the course, we gave ourselves a window of 5 weeks. So phase 2 was moving to enhanced model, and again we had to relearn everything in order to move to a more pedagogically driven format. And now what we're doing, of course, is we've got a window of 2 to 3 months in which to represent the entirety of the program experience. And again, we're having to rethink, relearn, and invent new models to do this. So yes, March was an extremely stressful time. Now is an extremely stressful time, and I imagine this will continue. But certainly I think as business schools, this effort is required if we're going to ensure that our programs maintain the same kind of impact that they did pre-COVID.
And you touched there, David, on that issue, of course, of the one thing that is impossible to reproduce online, which is that face-to-face experience. What do you think at least is the nearest possible, the best alternative to that, or the most powerful way to try to substitute for it?
Well, I think we're focused on outcomes. I mean, students go to business schools for a reason, and the reason they pay these high fees is that because they leave with a different career trajectory to the one that they came in with. And we go back to first principles and say, well, how do we achieve that? And it's not just those live classes, even though they're very important. There's a whole range of experience, whether it's the assessments, the projects, the clubs and societies, the career support, the auxiliary supplements, and so on. And we believe it's the entirety of the experience that enables students to move from one career trajectory to another. And so I think what's necessary is to sort of consider all of those elements of the experience individually, and then use care and craft to ensure that they're replicated successfully online. So, you know, we're not looking at sort of blanket approaches or templates or simple approaches. Every single element needs extreme amounts of care and attention if it's to work. And I think that's why we're all sort of scrambling around and going through mountains of work in order to make sure that happens come September in our case.
And I think we've already had a question come in, and I would encourage all others who are taking part to share their experiences and their questions from now on. But David specifically, yeah, Stephen asks here, what do you mean by the enhanced module? We touched on some aspects of it, but are there others as well that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, so in essence, I think we all had to move to webinar format. It was the only option. We had to move really quickly. But that doesn't really sort of take advantage of the digital medium. And I don't think any of us would stand behind that as an optimal approach to online learning. So the question is, what is the optimal approach? And I think you know, we have a huge volume of evidence as to what works and what doesn't work. And what we've tried to do is to look at that body of evidence and say, what simple things can we implement in 5 weeks? So we looked at things like, let's make the courses more social. Let's make them more structured. You have a clear structure telling students exactly what they need to do and when. Let's make sure they're supported so that students have access to tutors and support when they need it. Let's make them experiential so that students are able to apply ideas, get feedback, and adjust their behavior. So we came up with sort of, we tried to, you know, sum up everything we know about online learning in 5 simple principles, and then apply these to the design of each course. So basically the enhanced model was moving away from that sort of technically driven solution, which is to move to webinars, and start putting in more pedagogically driven exercises and activities to make the experience more effective.
And I see, Amy, you were nodding there. Is that a similar sort of experience that you've had?
Yes, and you know, one of the things that we think about here is how do we become completely digitally resilient as a business school, because we may have to self-quarantine again. We may have some people on campus and some people who have to attend either remote learning or even remote teaching. So we are doing the same thing that David's talking about in literally creating an inventory of asynchronous tools that are in 8 to 12 minute bite-sized chunks, back to Julia's comment, and making it so that the live experience that is in this is really the flipped classroom. So what is happening that is live is going to be discussion-based, experiential, et cetera. But the other thing I wanted to mention, because we're a little unique here, is we have 14,000 undergraduates studying business. 3,000 of them did not have a laptop, because this is a school where very poor students can come and attend. So we literally loaned out all of the laptops from the library to our students. We loaned out, you know, hotspots for those that didn't have any kind of form of Wi-Fi. So the challenges are actually pretty significant when you're dealing with scale like we were and we are, and with a big population that doesn't have access to an amazing, you know, learning experience online or Zoom at all.
No, and that's a very powerful point about what infrastructure is available to people, particularly from more modest backgrounds. We've seen it very much in the UK in high schools and below as well, and the challenge of online learning. So it's a very useful reminder. But no, Mohan, switching to you for a second and coming back to this point of, you know, what perhaps the ideal balance looks like of different different sorts of online approaches in order to engage students meaningfully? What would you put in your package?
Yeah, so I think that let me respond to this in two ways. One is how can you enhance the live component of the experience, and then how can you enhance through asynchronous components? So in the live component, there were actually things that we could do in the Zoom webinar world that we could not do in a classroom. Let me give you two, three examples from my personal experience. In one case, I run a simulation game. So this simulation game, every day, student teams make decisions, and then we have a presentation of the results, and then the simulation runs again. Now, this would have been very difficult to manage logistically in a physical classroom, but we would do 20-minute Zoom calls at 5 p.m. saying, here's the results. People would come in, and then we would, launch the simulation for the next day. It was all purely virtual. So that, and we had a live auction as part of the simulation. In the live auction, they would have to go and cabal in their rooms and decide the bid prices, and then come back to see the results. All that worked beautifully in Zoom. In fact, to the extent that if I ever go back to a physical classroom with no restrictions, I will still run this virtually. That's something important to understand, that there are elements. Similarly, being able to use, in one session, I was able to bring in 6 guest speakers for 5-minute segments from 6 parts of the world. There's no way I could have done that in a physical classroom. So I think that we should see crisis as an opportunity. There's a lot of, the medium allows breakouts, 5-minute breakouts. There's no such thing as a 5-minute breakout in a physical classroom, but you could do that. Have them look at a question, come back and discuss and respond. You can watch hand raising. And I can actually go back and see the videos and see who participated and who didn't. So those are the benefits of the live medium. But in addition to that, adding asynchronous components. For example, if I'm teaching accounting and I want to teach break-even analysis, that's boring in a classroom, So you can do the break-even analysis in a 5-minute video, give them an exercise, but then make sure that as they come into the classroom, you're integrating that discussion back to the concept. So you can offload some of the more direct to student instruction. That's the whole idea of the flipped classroom. So that's where we're going in the long run. But I think we should see that I believe that a blended approach, both to pedagogy and to content design, actually produces superior outcomes to the traditional in-person, 100% in-person classroom. And that's the opportunity that we see going forward.
Sure. And Julia, just coming to you, you mentioned already the importance, for example, of variety of quizzes and other forms of interaction. Any other thoughts on, the sweet spots here? What does work in terms of keeping students engaged and learning online in the ideal package?
I think, I want to come back to what David mentioned earlier on, which really struck a chord with me, saying we need to focus on the outcomes. And I think particularly during the current time, because on one side, there is a huge influence of Corona on their lives, on their careers, on the future, and on the future of the business environment, right? So there's tremendous change we're going through. And on the other side, there's a new medium of this online education, which requires a lot of attention, and the attention span getting shorter and shorter. So I think for me, a very important point is really, going back to those outcomes and really thinking about the relevance to their lives, relevance to their careers, relevance to their career change. And I think it means on one side, rethinking maybe the course. I mean, I was lucky, I teach impact investing, social entrepreneurship, social intrapreneurship. So there's a topic which is anyway very much of interest. But I think, generally trying to think what are the type of subjects or the focus within the subjects that would be most relevant to them. How does it fit into changing reality we're living through, and also emphasizing it. So I felt that, every time, in the beginning of the class or the day, I would tell them how they could use what we would be learning today, in which type, and that it's not only just a narrow for financial professionals, a narrow use, but people in different types of professions can use it, and that actually can boost their career. And I think that actually drives the attention towards really learning and not just being there. So I think that actually worked very well. And then another point, which was already maybe touched by Mohammed, regarding the practitioners. I think, I come from the practitioner side, but I feel that it's really, really very important to have practitioners on the course. So I integrate even in the traditional course, you know, a day, two practitioners, just even, you know, 45 minutes, but just to give them really exposure to much more, you know, more people from the industry. And I think I agree that in the online context, you can get a bigger variety, and it's much less cost prohibitive to get, you know, speakers flown from different countries. So I think that is definitely, you know, a big advantage.
Yes, I mean, and Amy, perhaps what Julia just says is something I've heard quite often. If there's been one benefit of the move online, it's been actually much easier to get a lot of senior executives and other practitioners to, you know, commit to an hour wherever they are in the world, as opposed to perhaps traveling across a continent to spend a day or more in a business school. Is that something that you've seen the value of and been able to take advantage of too?
Oh, we have, because Arizona is, you know, in the middle of, it's a flyover state, as many people say in the United States. And so our alumni live everywhere. And our alumni, our affinity with alumni has increased as a result of COVID, because we can beam them in as guest speakers. And if they're willing to give their time, I find people are being very, very kind right now during the pandemic, because we're all going through this together. And you know, there's really neat tools too. I loved Mohan saying he can go back and look at the videos. You know, we have Slack channels, and Slack channels is the version of the private chats that normally would happen if you were sitting next to someone about this. And Slack also will get comments from the people who were too shy to ever raise their hand. And even if you coached them and gave them warm calls, people were very uncomfortable. So now if they can use the chat function, or if they can use a Slack channel, they're speaking up and their voices are being heard like they've never been heard in the past. So it's terrific.
Yeah. And David, obviously Imperial has the benefit of being in London, so a big international capital with lots of senior execs who could pretty quickly come in anyway. But even for you, has it been easier perhaps to gain access to a wider variety of geographically spread external voices?
I mean, this is something we've been pursuing for quite a number of years. But I mean, I think broadly speaking, what the panel's talking about is a whole range of good ideas, and I think this is what we're sort of witnessing across our school too. Just hundreds of good ideas for each course, and I think this again speaks against the idea of sort of cookie cutter approaches. You know, I think education is a craft, and the idea of bringing in external speakers is one of hundreds of small innovations that we're witnessing across the school, I think. And to segue into that, I mean, I think the innovation we're going through is absolutely extraordinary. There's no way we could have had this conversation 4 months ago, I don't believe.
So the most popular question that's coming up, I see, is around, and of course it doesn't just apply to them, but particularly international students and the continued uncertainties about whether they'll be able to travel, assuming schools can reopen largely in September. So how will your different schools handle particularly that international contingent and the uncertainties that lockdowns and travel restrictions will impose?
So Andrew, we are in the thick of that, and I'm leading that effort at Kellogg. So what we have decided is that we will make a provision for 100% of our courses for either remote teaching or remote learning, because it's not only international student. What if a faculty member is immunocompromised and they don't want to go into a physical classroom to teach? We have to allow for that. So all of our courses will be live streamed from a physical classroom or remotely. So to allow for international students or anybody else who's not able to come. What if we go into lockdown again? So we have to be resilient. We have to basically have a architecture or a pedagogical approach that allows us to flip a switch. So basically the way we will be operating, and I think most other schools will be too, is we will have socially distanced classrooms. And we have done maps, which, you know, put 6 feet distance. We are coming up with about a 25% capacity, is about, you know, a classroom of 65 or 70 can accommodate about 23 or 24 people. And then the rest of the people will be, attending remotely. And what we are, and of course, the classroom will be a lot of technology to be put in so that the faculty can see the speakers, the remote people can see the classroom, and so on. But in addition, what we are planning to do is rotate. So we have roomies and zoomies. The people who are in the room and then people who are on Zoom. So let's say a class of 60 people, there will be 30 roomies. And even if all 60 are on campus, they will rotate. So once a week they come in class, and once a week they're virtual. So based on these sorts of ideas, and in some situations, we are also planning to have all virtual sections and then all in-class sections of the same course, and students can bid for one or the other. So I think that we do absolutely have to accommodate for the possibility that not 100% of your students and not 100% of your faculty will be able to attend in person. So that's kind of how we're handling it.
Who else like to come in on this question of international students and the uncertainties? Yeah, David, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to support what Mohan saying. I think we're adopting exactly the same approach. And the only nuance I'd add is that, in London, we're expecting our campus to open, partially open, close, maybe more than once throughout the academic year. And the issue with the international students is that the same thing will probably be happening in their countries, but to a different timetable. And so resilience and flexibility is absolutely key. So we're implementing these multimodal classrooms in order that students can choose on a class-by-class basis almost, whether they can attend in class or online. So I think this approach that Mohan's describing is the one that we're adopting too for the same reasons, and it should certainly help with the international students get comfort that they can attend when they are able to.
Mm-hmm. Amy?
Yeah, our international students, we're going to do this exact same thing that David and Mohan just talked about. We're also looking obviously at time zones. When are these classes going to be offered? We also have the advantage of having partnerships already in China. And so our Chinese students are likely to start with our partners as visiting students and be able to transfer in onto campus as soon as they're able to with a visa. And so we've got a lot of options that we're trying to come up with right now. When we don't have an in-country option, then we're trying to just be as supportive of the students. And there again, I worry about the students coming from emerging nations. Do they have the right technology to learn from home? Do they have the right bandwidth? So I think we just have to be very individualized almost with each student and figure out what do they need to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Julia, any thoughts from the schools you're involved with?
I think I'm probably not the best place to respond. I know that there are plans being put together to allow for all the students to attend and also to work in the eventuality of multiple close downs.
So another really interesting question here, which I'm hearing a lot at the moment, is we're talking about this kind of the challenge of the substitution of online. What about when it comes to placements and internships? How are your different schools trying to cope with that challenge? Amy, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So what we're finding right now is that all of our students were able to get internships this summer, but they're micro internships and they're remote. So the employers still believe internships are a good way to, get an assessment of fit. And even though the students are working from wherever, they're able then to really get a meaningful applied experience. Now, some of them are getting the traditional long, internship, but it's just remote. But a lot of them are getting these shorter term. And as in terms of placement, we really haven't seen much fall off other than the students that were late to seek. And so if you waited until March to think about getting a job, then it's gotten pretty hard for you. But you just really have to stay dogged on the students that you just simply can't wait until close to graduation. And I think that this will be another benefit of the pandemic, is that most of our slackers who wait until close to graduation to worry about a job they're going to remember COVID and maybe they'll get moving a little bit earlier.
Mohan?
We are very fortunate. What we did is we reached out to our alumni and appealed to them for leads for internships and placements, and we had 270 leads generated through that. In fact, the alumni were we're really pleased about the fact that we have 100% placement and internships. There is no fall off. Now the mix has evolved a little bit. We are seeing, of course, based on where the economy is, and if you look at the stock market, big tech is hiring a lot, and big tech is also more adaptable to. So, the Amazons, Microsofts, and Facebooks of the world have a better understanding of remote work. In fact, I was just talking to some of the students who started their internships, and it's actually going surprisingly smoothly. Where I was asking them, how have they onboarded you? How have they, so it's actually much better than they expected. Now, of course, this is an unusual response to an unusual situation. I don't know what it looks like in the steady state, but in the short run, we haven't seen much disruption at all. The format has changed, but I think all of our students are very productively employed.
Mm-hmm. David, have you been able to go online or even still find some physical forms of internship and placements for students?
Oh, they're all online, by the way. I was just want to say.
No, sure. David?
I mean, it changes every week, and it might be different next week. But at the moment, certainly all plans are for online. And I think I could speak more generally about employer engagement, because I think I tend to work on the program side, and we are working all hours and being very creative and going through mountains of work. And our careers team are doing exactly the same thing. And I think at first there was hope that this was a sort of temporary blip, and that everything could be perhaps postponed by a few weeks, or adjustments could be made to the timetable. But I think it's now dawning on us that we need to prepare for the disruption to last across the academic year. And I think employers are typically on board with this as well, and are working very closely with our team, both on internships and also in matters of recruitment and careers fairs and so on. So it's another whole area that requires attention and care and craft to do well.
So Julian, I mean, you're welcome to come in on that, but otherwise there's always the kind of sensitive question that comes up in this context, which is the price of education, how far the perception that online is, cheaper or less valuable should be reflected in the prices charged. Any views on that? Someone from outside, also faculties directly?
Yes, no, I think it is indeed a very sensitive question, and I do think that the expectations would be lower pricing if the courses will be continuously only online. I also felt that some of the students were also very much disappointed by the lack of on-campus experience. So it's not just a matter of price, but also the matter of how do we create the network? How do we actually, get the experience of an MBA, which is not comparable. So I think that's a question that needs to be discussed. Also, not just how we adjust pricing, but how we make sure that this valuable aspects of MBA experience can be still provided in the post-COVID environment.
Mohan, is there any discussion of any fee cuts or changes to the pricing structure if online becomes the norm?
You don't pay for the food and room and board, but that's about it. But no, I think that the question that we should address is not reducing the price, but increasing the value. Because it should never be a price conversation, be a value. And David articulated this very eloquently. He said that you have to think about the 360-degree experience and really engineer with care and craft each of the elements of that experience to fill in the gaps and to add innovations that were not possible, earlier. So, and one point I'd like to make is that there's a difference between in person and in class. In person doesn't have to be in the four walls of the classroom. So for example, one of the things we're trying to do in the pre-term, where we have 500 students doing a crisis simulation and a live-in week, we can't have them all in the classroom. But you know what we're going to do? We're thinking of bringing in CEOs and having socially distanced conversations in the, outside on the campus, where the CEOs walk them through how they're dealing with the post-COVID crisis. So that's an in-person experience, but it's not an in-class experience. So I think we all have to be creative, and we have to sort of pay a lot of attention to the fact virtual networking, one-on-one with faculty, virtual coffees. So just sort of adding and connecting alumni in small chats, coffee chats with alumni. These are ways in which we're trying to engineer various aspects of the experience, because I think we have to stand firm on the value. And it's a slippery slope if you start having that discounting conversation, because that's the wrong way to think about it. It's really about how do we provide them the value.
That said, Amy, Arizona State's obviously long had a commitment to affordability and social access. So is online changing your thoughts on pricing?
No, so we were one of the earliest brick and mortar universities in the US to launch an online MBA. And we committed to a strategy of the same faculty teaching face-to-face as online. And the rigor has to be there if you teach face-to-face and online. You can't treat one set of students any differently. So we've always priced our programs to be equivalent to the in-person, in-classroom experience, as Mohan just said. So we think that was very important for us to differentiate our online MBA, because people were so skeptical, particularly early on, about online and how could it be a more rigorous learning environment. I was a faculty member when they made that decision to launch it, and I'm a case discussion-based teacher, and I thought, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Well, thank goodness now I wasn't dean then, because it's turned out to be fabulous. And you can really do almost anything if you set your creativity to it and say, how could I do this? And so I love the idea of thinking in person as opposed to in classrooms. Arizona has beautiful weather, and we've actually built outdoor classrooms on our campus. They're socially distanced. They have air conditioning and a ceiling fan, but otherwise it's not really air conditioning. It's kind of like a mister. But all the technology is there for the faculty to stand there and teach. So we'll see. Maybe it'll be too hot, but we're going to try it and see if people like it.
But not something, David, perhaps we can do so much in London all the time.
Yeah, we can do it for 60 days in Chicago, Amy, and then the socially distanced frozen classrooms in January.
Yeah. But David, I see there's a question that casts this theme in a different way, which is to say, if the price is still going to stay the same, but at least the perception of value or the pressure for pricing is lower, are there alternative or add-ons or enhancements that would at least justify a more blended and partly online experience?
Yeah, I bristle a little bit at this question, the reducing costs, because it seems to imply that online is somehow inferior. And as someone who's devoted their 20 years in the pursuit that it isn't, I kind of bristle at this question. I think if you look at costs, the costs are the same. So there's no justification to reduce price on costs. If you put enough care into the quality of your degree, the impact's the same, so there's no less impact. So I think the question is, why do we get these demands for lower costs? And I think it's because there is a large segment of the market who perceive online to be somehow inferior and lower quality. And I think, why is this? And I think that perhaps the MOOC movement didn't help by charging $59 for a module. I think that certainly affected the market's perception of cost. Perhaps the immediate move to webinars that we all made, perhaps that was inferior. So maybe students were right to start thinking about their fees. But I think online learning done well has the same impact, the same quality, and can often enhance outcomes. So I think as a sector, what we should really be doing is sort of trying to change that mood in the market that online is somehow inferior, because it isn't inherently, only when it's done badly. So I think hopefully this price pressure is a short-term issue, and when we've learned all the lessons from COVID-19 and we've all learned how to do online really well, then the market perception will change.
And it's
Andrew, I
interesting.
just want to make a
Yeah,
quick
please.
comment here that there is life beyond Zoom. I mean, this is a very crappy experience. So there are a couple of experiments that we are running. One is holographic telepresence, which projects 3D lifelike images. And in fact, Imperial has done some pilots there too. So actually an alum of one of our alums runs the company. So that is really presenting multiple speakers from multiple locations on a virtual stage that are holograms. So that's one immersive experiment. Another immersive idea is using something like Cisco's telepresence technology, which actually simulates so imagine that you have 10 people, 10 executives in 7 locations. I've actually done a pilot like this. They're all in physical classrooms, but they're all connected through high definition teleconference and video conference, not Zoom, but something like telepresence, which really replicates it's an online experience, but I think there's a whole class of immersive digital experiences with AR, with VR, with these sorts of technologies. So I think Zoom has gotten too popular for its own good. There is life beyond Zoom.
Absolutely.
And of course, yes, I mean, there's no doubt, as you say, David, there are very significant additional costs. It's not just about a Zoom call or a live video session of a classroom, is it? I mean, you have to invest substantially if you want, for example, follow-up, supervision and support asynchronously, and sort of tutor time with students and so on. I mean, any sense perhaps from each of you, sort of actually what the net cost would be of a full blended high quality course compared with a more traditional, perhaps in-person one? Are we talking a significant multiple, for example, even with economies of scale as you build perhaps an effective platform? Amy, any thoughts on that?
I think the costs are actually higher than the classroom, because you actually have all of these tools, right, that you need to either create or contract for to put to meet the shrinking attention span. As Julia said, in online courses, you have to have people who are professional instructional designers and who understand online learning, coaching a faculty member. Most faculty members, they don't ever get trained on how to teach. Some of them do, but when you walk into a classroom, it's just you. Now, of course, if we're going to have a blended availability, we're going to have technology in the classrooms. So I think there's increased costs associated with the pandemic and increased costs associated with an online course. And there will be for certain with a blended one. If you imagine how it will work when people are either teaching remotely or learning remotely and others are in person or in the classroom.
Mohan, any thoughts on the cost, the differential cost?
I think the costs shift, but they're not there. It's not cheaper. If you think about, so for example, these online executive programs that we are developing, each of these modules, as David called them, it's $100,000 development effort. It's product development, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to invest up front. You need a studio, you need instructional designers, you need professional, post-production. It's a 6-month effort. So what if you were to take 100 courses and move them into blended format? It's a huge investment of capital up front. It pays itself back in scale later, right? So I think there are investments in technology that we'll have to. The holographic telepresence I was talking about, one event for one day will cost you $25,000. So so it's not, the technology does have costs. But the other observation I want to make is that you don't teach online, you perform. And not every faculty member is comfortable with this. We all have to be more Italian, right? So camera flattens you, so you have to project, you have to gesture. I've had colleagues sit in front of a camera for a recording and forget their name. It's just a freeze, and there are brilliant teachers in the classroom. So so not everybody's going to make this transition, which is one of the dirty things we don't want to talk a lot about, but. This is not everybody's cup of tea, and some people are going to be very resistant to change, and we have to try and be as inclusive as possible, but not everybody's going to make this transition. That's just a thought that I'd like to throw out there, somewhat provocative, but
Yeah. So Julia, maybe touching on this question from the teacher perspective. There's a couple of questions here around the extra burden that teaching online requires, including those extra efforts of performance, as Mohan was just saying, but also perhaps even additional technical support around the production and the delivery and so on. Do you have any reflections on that, and what you would like to see perhaps in terms of support from faculties?
I think I very much like it has been mentioned before. I think, pre-recording some parts of the courses for the preparation. And I think both Amy and Mohammed mentioned that to take out the boring lecturing part, have them study beforehand and really, try to reshuffle the classes to make them very interactive. Try to use different mediums, and David mentioned that, how do you provide, value add in a different way? I think that's where we should be going. It cannot be done short term. I think it's more for the next year. I agree it requires investment, but I think if we manage that, it could be actually even a richer experience. And then I think coming to the previous question of pricing, you can actually justify that actually you're getting much more than an in-person class, right? In terms of the access experience, in terms of the practical benefits and people and network, given the type of speakers you will be getting. But it is very, very time and very time consuming, and it's a huge effort to pre-record certain parts. It's not just lecturing, you need to prepare. I'm thinking about that for the executive education. It is quite an effort. And I think, if the university can support professors on that, that is fantastic, and that would be necessary.
So just coming back to the question of value added, we've got a few reflections here online, but thinking, for example, about the issue of networking and about the value of socializing for the student groups. What, if at all, are you coming up with as strategies to try to meet those needs, for example, without the need for face-to-face? David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the most challenging parts of online. I mean, at Imperial, I said we've been doing hundreds of online courses each year, but actually we don't do anything purely online. We always have a face-to-face element to our courses, at least at the beginning of the program. And the reason for that is to forge those human connections. It's much easier to, if you've met someone face-to-face, it's then much easier to sustain that relationship online. And that's a very serious challenge at the moment when we're not able to meet face-to-face. It's harder to form these relationships. And unfortunately, forming these relationships is a key part of an MBA experience, whether it's relationships with peers, with your faculty, with your careers advisors, and so on. So it's super hard to do, and perhaps one of the things that we'll never quite do as well online. But I think a major part of it is at least recognizing the problem and then trying to tackle it. And so what we're doing at Imperial is trying to recognize all the different ways in which those touch points are made, and then for each one try and craft an experience that will enable the relationships to be pursued. I mean, the good news is that I think that all the actors involved, whether it's the students, the faculty, the alumni, the careers people, everyone recognizes this to be an issue, and everyone's motivated to solve it. And I'm sure we'll make very significant progress, but whether it will be the same as having that opportunity to initially meet face-to-face, I don't know. I think it's a tough question.
Anybody else want to come in on that? Amy, please.
Yeah, we tried this year a few things that might help. We advanced our orientations and what we call a preview day, where people would come and get to meet each other on campus. And so we've done that through a webinar, and then created the Facebook groups and whatever is age relevant, right? TikTok, I don't know what that is, but whatever the groups are, and then we've created them, and they're on WeChat, they're on WhatsApp, they're on Slack together. And so they actually are bonding right now, especially with the international students, because this is not, we're not monitoring it. So they're able to share their fears about not being able to come, or what's the job market going to look like. And so they actually are creating relationships with each other through these channels. And the semester is, you know, many weeks from even starting.
Mohan?
Yeah, I think that that we are similarly looking at ways in which you can start to do bonding and virtual sort of experiences before you come to the classroom, whether it's with alumni, whether it's one-on-one chats with faculty, or whether it's a coffee chat with the dean. Those are sorts of ways in which we can, you know, build that social connection, because that is one thing that I think is very difficult to replicate. We've talked a lot about online learning, but you know, that social bonding, we need to think carefully about how, and empathetically about how we engineer that, and particularly for international students. So this is less of a challenge for our second year students, but for the first years, you know, starting out virtually is not the best thing in the world. So that's something we have to be very sensitive to.
Mm-hmm. Julia, any thoughts?
I think, you know, we can learn here because the whole industry of conferences and networks are struggling with the same things. And there's a lot of interesting, you know, experiments going. There's like, you know, speed dating going on where the technology actually, you know, have you meet the new person every 5 minutes. And I think that could be used, you know, through the students. I think another point is, you know, having a hybrid class with some parts of asynchronous learning where you have discussion boards where people actually can express, you know, their opinions and get to know each other, and maybe, you know, start also through the introduction. You know, and, you know, as Mohammed said, you know, there are all those, you know, virtual cocktails and meetings that you can do. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's better than nothing.
I had a bottle of wine delivered to all of my students in the final class physically. Then we had a toast. It was for the graduating students. We called it the final toast. And we brought in they brought in pets, significant others, anybody else in family. And it was 15 minutes, but it was just a really nice way to touch people physically, virtually.
So not just a holographic bottle of wine.
No, it was a real bottle of wine. So we were all drinking the same wine, the same
So that's a great bonding. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to just ask, in a second, I'm just going to ask each of you for one perhaps tip, particularly focused maybe on those in faculties who are starting to think really about now, you know, what's the key things they should bear in mind as they prepare for the coming academic year in terms of what will almost certainly be a blended, if not a fully online experience. But just briefly, if any of you wanted to take this, there's a few questions about coming back to this question of engagement, how to sustain student interest, and also how to assess student feedback on online. I don't know if anyone wants to just briefly come in on that. Mohan, maybe you're nodding.
Yeah, maybe I'll give you a very quick fight because I want to keep this under 30 seconds. Chunk down your content into 15 to 20 minute segments. Intersperse each of those chunks with an interactive exercise, like a breakout room, a discussion, a poll. A poll is a good way to check the temperature of the class in a case discussion. Would you want to do this or would you want to do that? Warm call on students. 2 hours before a class, I will send an email to a team saying, you will be presenting your NPV analysis. So now everybody's on their toes that they gotta all do they don't know who's gonna be called. So warm calling, cold calling, hand raising, using a content moderator who is able to monitor the class and who's raising hands and so on. Go back to your records of who participated and who didn't, and then figure out who you're going to cold call on. Take your case studies and break them down into episodes. So if you've got 3 issues in a case, we used to teach 90 minutes and then debrief. Now what I do is I make it into a 4-act play. Start, raise a question, debrief. Start, raise a question, debrief. So that's, you know, some of the ways that I've dealt with.
Julia, in a brief nutshell, what would be your key recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think, you know, one is variety of formats. I think absolutely key so that it's not boring. And second, you know, keep them on the toes, you know, so that they know they could be asked any moment and they will be, they could be put on the spot. I think that's that keeps the attention, and obviously relevance. I think that's for me very key.
David, overall, your top tips for folks as they're trying to plan for the autumn?
Yeah, I mean, everything Mohan said, breaking learning down into chunks, adding variety, making them experiential. Avoid cookie cutter approaches, standard approaches that you don't, if you don't believe it applies to your teaching. Trust your instincts, and use creativity and craft as you do in your face-to-face classes.
Thanks very much. And Amy, a final word to you then. What would be your advice to your colleagues, deans and others, administrators in schools as they're gearing up for the coming term?
Yeah, well, I think for faculty, what I would suggest is try new things. And if they don't work well, admit it in front of the students, that we're all learning together, and innovation means learning from mistakes.
Well, thank you very much for incredible insights, really helpful. Thank you all very much, everybody who's been actively sharing their thoughts and their questions online. A reminder, you will be able to view this afterwards, and I hope the panelists will be able to follow up if there's any specific questions. A reminder too that we will have 2 more of these sessions, one that will be discussing the integration of real-time content, media, data, and other things at this very fast-moving time of change. That is Thursday the 9th at the same time. And then the following week on the 14th, we've got a broader discussion on the future of the MBA overall in the time of COVID. So thanks again, everybody, for taking part. Really great discussion, and stay in touch and good luck in the coming year.